Julian Chan is our first speaker. He has been my lawyer for a decade almost. He helped me with incorporating my first startup, which no longer exists. But I loved his attention to detail, very thorough. But Julian, I'll let you take away because I don't want to. But
Sure. Okay, so I'm a graduate of Brown University and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I started out as a lawyer in 1995 in Boston. And I found myself general counsel of a startup company that ended up raising two rounds of $7 million each from Greylock and Matrix, and was quite a learning lesson about predatory VCs, or vulture capital as it's sometimes called. And our company went public in 97, fixing the year 2000 problem, the 3 years before the year 2000 problem. And after it went public, I was there for another year, and I decided I didn't like working in a public company. So I decided to start an angel fund incubator, one of the very first, with offices in Boston, San Francisco, and LA. And we ended up finding all our group of friends who had started public companies, one with Kwang Yi Yu, who basically developed the computers that broke the human genome and ended up selling his company Paracel to Celera Genomics, and ended up making relationships with UCLA and a number of Dr. Eisenberg over there, people that were figuring out how to do algorithm on protein analysis to figure out how to predict this back in the 90s. And in 98, I was one of the first people to be pitched by Google when they were raising $500,000 to buy a third of their company. And I unfortunately passed on that deal. So I ran an incubator for a number of years, ended up moving to Los Angeles and worked with Hans Zimmer and his internet website company. And that grew to 300 million in revenue with operations in China. We became one of the largest game distributors in China and died right before our IPO for a number of reasons that have to do with problems working internationally. I went back to legal practice. I have about 400 clients, and in this space, one of my clients is a fellow named Andrew Huberman. Some of you may know he's the #3 podcaster in the U.S., focusing on health issues. He's a professor out of Stanford. Runs a podcast called Huberman Labs. So that's a little bit of my background. So just to jump into common issues, I think the first thing you should realize is the team is one of the most important things that you do when you start up. And you really need to have good legal and good accounting because you don't want to start with the wrong foundation. If you start with the wrong foundation, sometimes it's irreversible. And it's a little hard to predict what everyone everyone's situation is not the same. But I will just say that the default is a Delaware C Corp. And the reason you do a Delaware C Corp is that there's something called small qualified business stock that says if you started out as a C Corp, that the investors get a $10 million tax avoidance. So they don't pay tax on the first 10 million of capital gains for each investor that invested when the company was under 50 million in valuation. You hold it for 5 years, and there's other series of qualifications. Okay, but generally speaking, if you're a venture capitalist, you're going to be looking for a C Corp because that's what can go public, and it has to always have been a C Corp. Otherwise, you don't get that tax treatment. Okay. Now, if you think that you're going to live off the revenue you have, then you might want to be an LLC. If you think you might be bought out by a private equity firm and not go public or have professional VCs, then you might want to be an LLC. So there's a number of complicated situations. There are some situations that you might want to be an S Corp. Like if you were a certain type of medical company where you don't qualify for QSBS, then you might not care and you start out as an S Corp. These are kind of complex, but the key thing is sometimes they're irreversible how you start. So it's very important that you start off on a good foundation. Don't start your company, get 6 months down the road, and then find out you have problems. And one of the other things that people should be aware of is something called work made for hire. And in the US, if you have a work made for hire, it's as if the company created it. But if you don't sign that contract in writing ahead of time. If you sign it after the fact, it becomes a license. And in some cases, it's a revocable license. So it's very important that you have your paperwork with anyone developing IP for you signed before they start the work. So this is why it's very important to make sure you have a good legal person to help you with the basic stuff. So again, work for hire contracts, figuring out what type of entity you should have, and having a good accountant. Okay, that's fundamental. You don't need to spend a lot of money, but you have to have that 1 or 2 or 3 hour conversation with your accountant lawyer and get those forms. And as I said, it shouldn't really take more than 2 or 3 hours to get the basic thing, but you just don't want to start off on the wrong foot. Okay. So what are the common type of investment structures? So typically you have common stock, assuming it's a Delaware C Corp. And why Delaware, by the way? Because 50% of all companies in the US are chartered out of Delaware. They have very stable law. Their judges are very good. They're very efficient. Whereas, say, California might take 3 years before a case moves through the court. Delaware might take a year or less, right? And the judges are very, very specialized in understanding business context. Whereas California, it might be all over the place because someone's doing criminal law one day, next day he's doing divorce, next day he's doing your case. So that's why Delaware C Corp tends to be the way to go. So generally your founders are going to get common stock. And typically there's going to be a vesting schedule because investors want to know that you want to stay around. And a vesting schedule is very important because what you don't want to do is find that the founders fight if someone leaves over equity trying to claw it back. And so the best thing is to discuss sort of a formula that works. You put it in place on day one, and you make sure that you don't need to discuss if something doesn't work out. In my experience, on average, out of 3 founders, one of them is gone by the end of the year. Gets a better offer somewhere else, spouse, moves and they go with that job. Many, they get sick, but at least 1 out of 3 disappears by the end of the year. So having a vesting schedule where you don't need to negotiate an exit, it's just what it is. It can basically prevent you from having a lot of fighting that can destroy your company. I'll give an example of fighting that destroyed a company. I saw a situation where an investor came in and encouraged one owner to try to kick the other owner out, and basically they didn't have the right to do that, and they ended up in a lawsuit right in the middle of a financing. And the last thing you want to do is have a lawsuit in the middle of while you're trying to close a financing. And even if you win, you lose because your investor says, "I don't want all my money to go to the lawsuit," right? So you become ripe for green mail. And so that's why it's very important to have vesting schedules, fair vesting schedules in place at the beginning. And if you have vesting schedules, you need to file something called an 83B election, something that you file within 30 days of when you when you take your equity. And what that does is it prevents you from paying tax every time your equity vests. Instead, you pay tax at the very beginning, which presumably is 0 because you're buying it at a extremely low price. Okay? So for founders, there's something called an 83B, and I'm not expecting everyone to remember all this, but I'm just mentioning it once so you hear about it, and also you get the idea how important it is to have a lawyer that knows. Because, as I said, if you miss that 30-day window, you can never go back and fix it. And the last thing you want to do is be paying tax on stock that vests over, say, 5 years based on current value. So, for example, if you bought it at a penny, or a hundredth of a penny, and then suddenly you got VCs investing at $20 a share, well, you're going to pay tax on $20 a share for whatever's vesting after that point in time. So that's not a good thing if you could just avoid it with an 83B. Okay. So now let's come to typical funding things. In the past, a venture capitalist would come in with what's called a Series A, and the idea of a Series A is that there was a preference that if the company went bankrupt or had some financial problem, the money that was in the company would go back to the Series A investors first and not necessarily go to the common holders. Okay, and so it was a protection for them. But the Y Combinator came up with an idea called a SAFE, Simple Agreement for Future Equity, which is a short 5-6 page document, which basically says I don't know what I'm going to get in the future. Uh, but uh, uh, but whatever I get in the future from a professional investor, I will get the same class of stock that that person has, but at a discount, 20 or 30% discount or something like that. And the idea of that was to make it for small investors to give initial funding, friends and family, and not have complicated paperwork. And so it was intended for, $50,000, $60,000 type of, deals. I have seen that swell to where it has become, $3 or $4 million. I recently saw a deal with $3 or $4 million deal was done on a safe, which from the company point of view is great because you've just given a document where the person, the holder of it, doesn't have shares, that can't vote it, and it may never convert. If the company fails, it's just dead. But if it converts into whatever's negotiated the next round. In the meantime, they're not voting, they're not having a say in the company unless the investor demands a side agreement. So that's one thing you should be aware of. And there's another thing called a convertible note, which is a little more favorable to the investor. So a little bit more sophisticated investor says, okay, I want some protections. And this is where it can get a little predatory. Okay. Convertible note basically is a loan, but the loan says it will turn into stock under certain conditions. And like a safe, it might be whatever the next round is at a discount. Okay. But often the investor will say, you know what, I might reserve the option not to convert it, that I will keep it as debt, especially if the company isn't doing that well. And in some cases, they could say, you know what, I'm going to put you in bankruptcy. If you don't start paying me back, and my payback terms are onerous, I could put you in bankruptcy, and now I have a preference, and maybe I can actually take your whole company away from you, right? Just like someone, if you miss a payment on your house, suddenly they own your house. So that could be a very dangerous thing, depending on whether it's optional for the investor to convert or not. And people can play with those terms, but this is why it comes to be very important for the investor, for the company to understand these things with their lawyers, so that they don't find themselves with a predatory investor that basically comes in and does this to them. Okay. Questions so far?
I think we don't have time for questions, Julian. Also, your time is kind of up. Do you have any final comments?
No,
And you
no.
can, okay,
I think the big issue in fundraising is that some people can be predatory, and
yeah,
so
for
the
sure.
best thing is to try to make sure that you are always talking to lots and lots of investors, and make sure they don't collude together. And it's better to take small amounts from each of them than have one large investor that will definitely have a plan for replacing you at some point in the future.
Yeah, I think the trend is no longer accepting safe in the angel investor community in the last couple of years, last 2 years. More people
Um,
are favoring convertibles, like you said.
you know what? I just closed $2.5 million on the safe.
Okay,
From a single person, and 5 million in safes, of which one person did two and a half on the safe. So I don't know that that's necessarily true.
right. It depends on the space as well.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. Thank you, Julian. Why don't you leave your contact info in the chat box so people can get in touch with you, and we'll share the video after the event. And
perfect. I posted it.
thank you so much. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.